and tell us a little bit about the beginning. Tell us, let's start a little bit about, kind of what you were going through when, when you were a child.
Well, like I say, I had a very, very supportive family, which was huge in my development because when my mom first was told about my diagnosis, it was a very grim picture that they told her when I was 2, and at that point I was still bouncing in the crib and still able to walk, and I wasn't in a wheelchair until I was about 11 years old. So it was a progressive illness, and when she first was diagnosed, the day I was diagnosed, this young intern doctor came up to her and said, whatever you do, don't raise her any different than you raised your other children. And so my mom took that and ran with it. So, and I was very fortunate. I was the baby of the family. So I had two older brothers and an older sister who kind of, worshipped me. I was like 10 years, I came 10 years later. So they were teenagers and they took me everywhere. So I had really a very blessed childhood. It was a blast. I look back on it not with you know sadness, even though I was going to the children's hospital every year. But I had a good time with my brothers and my sisters and all their friends, and went to all their parties and all their crazy adventures I went on. And my mom and dad never raised me any differently than they did my siblings, and so I was always brought up to know I could do anything I wanted, and I could be just like everybody else. And I never really thought of myself as different, even though I couldn't do everything that, as I said, the running and the skipping and the jumping. That, but that wasn't an issue because I was so busy with everything else in my life that I had a very fulfilled childhood all along. So
Yeah,
I never did without. That's for sure.
yeah, and I think that's an epic point, and that's what a lot of people need to realize. It's interesting the way you put it because you admit that your parents didn't quote unquote treat you any differently than anybody else, but technically, and I'll say technically, they did. I shouldn't say they did. Most parents would force kids to go outside and run and play and jump, or at least today in the world today, especially
Right.
parents with all the. So let me ask you that question before I make an assumption. For your brothers and sisters, were your parents an active things like saying, "Hey, go outside and play," or did they? I guess that's the best way to put that question. Were your parents the type of parents who wanted your brothers and sisters to go outside and play and kind of nudge them and said, "Hey, why don't you go out and play?"
Well, I think because, as I said, my siblings were teenagers. They were out and about and running and doing all their things anyways, and I just tagged along everywhere they went. They literally took me everywhere that they went. So, and I was going wherever they were going. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just did whatever they did, and whether they were snowmobiling, and we had a boat, and we went out water skiing and swimming, and we were always active. Our family was always active.
Yeah.
It was just we were as a family out doing. So it just never crossed my mind, I guess, to be any other way.
And that I think is that I believe is the real key and one of the key learnings from your beginning. We always like to talk about the things that people learned from different or teaching and or learn. So I'm going to say what I believe is a teaching, and I'm going to ask you kind of what you learned. I believe one of the teachings that comes from that is the fact of your perception was that your parents, and I'm not saying they were or weren't, but the perception, your perception, how you viewed it, because our perception is reality, is that your parents weren't treating you any different than they treated your brothers and sisters, even though you were doing different things. And I think that is so key. Fact of the matter is that, whether you're a coach, a consultant, whether you're a business owner, whether you're a speaker, or you're trying to motivate people, it's about the perception that people have of not being treated differently versus
That's
I'll say a reality that they would have had to have treated you at least a little bit. If they were parents who pushed their kids to go out and play when they were young, they would have had to treat you at least a little bit differently because they knew you couldn't go out and run around. I mean, it's kind of, but they pushed you to do what you could do. So, what was your learnings from
that's
that time as you look back now? What did you learn from your beginning and that you either have applied in your life or continue to apply today?
Well, I was always encouraged to do what I could do, and like I said, my my mom and dad owned businesses, so I did get a lot of my business credentials from learning from through their experiences. And as a little girl, going down to the stores on Sundays and filling the thread racks because they owned a fabric store. And so my mom was a custom seamstress, so she taught both me and my sister how to be custom seamstresses. So I grew up with the creative aspects as well. So I was always making my own clothes and designing and, sewing at all times, putting materials together, fabrics together. So we definitely had the creative side. We had the business side. As I said, we were always out in nature. So I had all of these types of things that I grew up with that have had a huge impact on who I am as an adult. And and like I say, because my mom and my dad were in that line of business, the creativity part was always there. And that was something, even though I couldn't walk, being creative was something very easy that I could do and get my hands on. And my hands were always busy, even though I never painted when I was young. Painting was not, a part of my realm at all, believe it or not. And art was not, when I first met my art teacher, I couldn't tell you the difference between a Da Vinci or Michelangelo. I didn't know anything about the masters, nothing. That was just not in our realm whatsoever. But even though I had been creative for my whole life, so that was a big learning curve when I did get into the art world. And yeah, thank God
Wow.
that exists.
Yeah, so I have a feeling that the turning point is going to be meeting your art teacher. So before we get to that and talk about how that, what you got from that experience, before getting into art, what you sound like you had a great childhood. Sounded like you had a lot of fun. Sounded like you were loved. What were you doing before you got into art?
Well, you know, uh, and I just want to backtrack one little bit here before I answer that question. In that, yeah, I had a pretty phenomenal childhood, but the fact of the matter is that I was a disabled person. I was in a wheelchair when I was 11. When I was 13, I had major back surgery, which didn't go very well. And so all of a sudden, the perfect world wasn't so perfect. And of course, you hit your puberty and all those peer pressure and everything. So that was the kind of part of my journey which wasn't so rosy and wasn't so good. And reality did kind of hit. And even though I had a fabulous family, uh, everything wasn't so great at that period. And I don't know, do you know about a fellow named Rick Hansen down there? I know I'm from Canada, and he's one of our Canadian heroes up here. He traveled around the world in his wheelchair, and he's very known here in Canada, but I don't know if he's known down in the States. But I wound up meeting him when I was 13, and that was one of those life-changing moments that I know you'd be interested in hearing about, because he had traveled, as I said, around the world and raising money for people who had had spinal cord injury like he had, and he was also raising awareness for people who had a disability. And he was the one that first told me that no matter what, just because you're disabled, it doesn't mean you can't do whatever you want to do in life. So yeah, he was a big motivator for me. And when I was 13 and I was in pain and things were not going so well, that's when, as the stars lined up, I wound up meeting him. And of course, I did not want to even go, because the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go meet some guy in a wheelchair. I had nothing to do with disabled people, and I was really angry. And my mom insisted. She said, "Look, you gave your word to the city that you would go and present him with an award from the city. You've got to go." So I dragged myself down there, dragged me, and he wheeled up on stage in his wheelchair, and I burst into tears. And I just sat there the whole time. I didn't say a word to him. I just sat there and cried and cried and cried. And it was just one of those moments that I was so not expecting. And the dam burst, and just I couldn't control my emotions whatsoever. And I had done a lot of charity work up to that point. And that night, the fellow from the Herald, the Lethbridge Herald, had phoned me, and he said, "Look,
Raise your hand if you could use more clients. Now keep those hands up if you know that the best, most efficient, most effective way to attract your ideal client is to create great client attracting content that connects with your ideal client and makes it easier for you to convert them into paying clients. Now, whether you have your hands up or have your hands down, I invite you to join me on the Create, Connect, and Convert Online Summit. It's where I and other people who are real world practitioners of creating great client attracting content are going to share our secrets with you. The summit is online. It runs Wednesday, April 13th through Saturday, April 23rd. You need to go out to the web address on your screen at this point, register to reserve your seat. And remember, you want to join us on the Create, Connect, and Convert Online Summit because creating content is how you spread your message, reach more people, and make a bigger difference.
To watch the rest of this epic episode now, click on the link below the video. Do it now, you'll be glad you did. Are you still here? What are you waiting for? Watch the rest of this epic episode now by clicking on the link below the video.